thank you, Matthew, so much for reaching out and inviting me on the podcast. It's a great pleasure, and I'm looking forward to getting to know you and your audience a little better throughout the podcast. But yeah, we were talking a little bit before we started rolling. For me personally, with conservatism, it's something that sort of slowly gotten there. Like I would say that when I was in university, I was very much a liberal on the left, and I even dabbled a little bit in reading Marx, and I sort of thought that that was the logical sort of conclusion of the way of thinking. And it wasn't until I really started being fully entrenched in the thinking of sort of modern feminism and Marxism that I realized how wrong it was for me personally. Like I didn't fully buy into it. It didn't feel right. The things that I were being told about women being oppressed and our society being racist and oppressive and all those things that the left believes, it didn't fall in line with my day-to-day reality. I just couldn't get into it, and so I fully rejected it and kind of went to the opposite end of the spectrum and became a pretty ardent libertarian, sort of anti-government person who still believed in the same sort of principles of justice and humanity and treating people how you'd want to be treated and all those kind of things, but more opposed to state intervention and compulsory laws or legislating morality. And I think as I've aged, I've gotten a little bit more comfortable with the idea of being a conservative, identifying that way, and thinking about the world in terms of the structures, the institutions, the structures in our society that have led to this situation where we have freedom, we have free markets, we have individual liberty, we have our rights protected and enshrined in a constitution, and thinking about how those systems all sort of work together and where they come from. And so that's sort of my personal journey to conservatism. And as far as the Canadian conservative movement, I think that it's a little bit harder to really define, because it's not an ideology. It's not like the left. It's not like Marxism. It's not, you can't just read one manifesto and say this is what we all believe in. I think maybe the closest that you could get to that would be maybe reading like Edmund Burke or perhaps Friedrich Hayek in terms of economics. But really, it isn't so much of a specific ideology, so much of a way of life, a set of values. The idea that we don't jump into the latest leftist fad. We take things slowly, incrementally. That we try to analyze what is the purpose of the system that's in place before we just willy-nilly remove it because we've identified a problem with it. We try to understand what the purpose is and try to enact social change, but in a slow and cautious way.
Precisely. Thank you first for saying that, Candice, too. I concur with many things that you said there. I think there is that element to conservatism, not just Canadian conservative, but conservatism as a whole, where it's a feeling, it's a posturing in the world. It's as you rightly said, it's not an ideology. There's no pamphlets or texts you're going to be the primary sources on it. You could read Burke, but Burke would be a very temporal figure as to how it's. I think there is one sense, which I think is kind of ironic. People think it's static, it's not changing. No, conservatism does change, but it's a different motion. It's a different motion in contrast to what might be said a left or liberal motion of movement. But it is interesting, I think as Canadians, we're so infatuated with our American cousins. We're so infatuated with their politics and television. I don't think we even take pride, and I mean that not as someone who's not playing party politics on either side here. I think that we would take pride in our particular style, our particular history of conservatism in Canada, and not just on a federal level, but even the particularities on a regional level and provincial level too. They do manifest differently, and rightly so.
Right. No, I think that's a really good point. There's a couple other sort of principles that I think are sort of overreaching among conservatives. There's sort of a skepticism towards grand designs and centralized power, which is a really important impulse to have. And finally, gratitude, feeling grateful and appreciative
Absolutely.
of the system we have. I hear so many people on the left, and their sort of righteous indignation or anger at the system. It's so overwhelming that it's like they've kind of lost perspective of like, hey, Canada's a great country. It's so remarkable. It's a wonderful place to live. People are coming from all over the world. They wait in queues. They wait years and years and years to legally immigrate to this country. We let in about a third of a million a year, and if we could, we'd let in more, and they would come. We did something right, and in the history of humanity, it's not a given. That's not something that's obvious, right? And so I think that everyone in our society, Matthew, would be, well advised to pause and take a moment of gratitude to appreciate where we live and what we have. Sure, can we fix the system? Absolutely. There's ways to improve it. There's things that we did wrong. There's things the country got wrong. But taking that moment to pause and appreciate what we have, I think is something that conservatives have across the board. And I wish that, look, there's millions of things that I would change about Canada. There's millions of criticisms and critiques I have, especially now in this time of huge government overreach with regards to COVID. But I think that before I start any criticism towards Canada, I first acknowledge that it's a great country and that we've gotten so many things right. And maybe it's our temperament, maybe it's our laws, maybe it's our values and our history and our culture, but all of those things together have created this really unique combination in the world. And we would be remiss to just completely abandon that and try something totally different, which I think is what a lot of people on the left do advocate for us. With regards to your question about what makes us different than our Americans, I'll tell you, my husband and I spent a couple of years down in California. Now, California is a really sort of trendy liberal left-wing place. We lived in the Silicon Valley, which is even more sort of trendy left-wing place. And I don't think that you would want to be outed as a Republican in that part of the world. I had a couple of Republican friends, and none of their friends knew that they were Republican. Their places of work certainly didn't know that they were Republican. But for us, we're Canadian and we're conservatives, and it was almost like a totally different brand. And people were like, oh, that's cool. Oh, that's interesting. And they didn't have the same sort of negative, visceral reaction to our politics, because sort of we're seen as more polite and less in your face and less interested in all the culture wars. Even though I think Canadian conservatives are interested in some of the culture war stuff. But True. I think that when it comes to our conservatism, it's seen as sort of more like high Toryism, like we're interested in preserving our traditions, our institutions, while also being a open-minded, culturally accepting, sort of more tolerant version, perhaps, than the sort of caricature of what people think of Republicans down in the States.
Right, and you allude to a good thought there, actually, Candice. With the high Toryism, with respect to Canadian conservatism, do you think that might be the not only the distinction, but also within that kind of method for individuals, young individuals, any individual who might not have any foreknowledge or any understanding about Canadian conservatism, about that particular style of conservatism? Do you think that's a good inlet to have that understanding through a high Toryism understanding of it?
Sort of like just saying that perhaps like temperamentally we're more reserved. Is that sort of what you mean, or?
Certainly. Well, sort of. I would kind of meant how would you what method, more or less, I'll rephrase my question. What methods would you think would be ideal to show individuals, whether you agree with it, whether you like it, whether it's your party or not, or your particular movement or not, or what would you do to say, hey, we're not American conservatism, we're not British really anymore. We have our own feel, and like, whether even if you dislike it, you should be proud of it. You should be proud of, like, but this is our particular style. We do things differently, and the history is different. It's grand. It's a very grand history. It's a part of the country. It's integral in every sense.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point. That, for instance, in the U.S. they had the founding fathers, and they were very steeped in Enlightenment thinking and Enlightenment philosophy when they crafted their Constitution. And in some ways, it wasn't partisan at all. It was very much a group of people that wanted their independence from Great Britain, and they wanted to have their own sort of experiment, a living thought experiment of a country based on these Enlightenment principles. And I think it's been an incredible incredible experiment in human history. I think that we all owe some gratitude to our American friends and cousins over the sort of fact that they grew this experiment into a global superpower that has pulled, enabled liberty, freedom, and markets all over the world. That pull billions of people out of poverty and above the poverty line. And again, this idea of governance by the will of the people and based on the idea that the government is not there the government is there to protect your rights. The government doesn't give you your rights. The government is there to stop others from infringing upon your rights, which, the principle is so important and so novel and so rare in global governance and human history. As far as Canada, our country was founded mostly by one founding father, Sir John A. Macdonald, who was a conservative. He was a Tory. And I think that party played an important role in creating, bringing together this vast piece of land. It wasn't inevitable that Canada was going to be, the British North America was going to stay separate from the United States. They had, their whole manifest destiny and the Louisiana Purchase and expanding the territory further and further west. It wasn't obvious that Western Canada wasn't going to get pulled into that. And so this kind of visionary leader saying, let's build a railway, let's develop this part of this really, inhospitable part of the world. If anyone's ever lived on the prairies, it's incredibly cold, and it's not an obvious place you would want to go and build a civilization. And so I think that the idea behind it, and I know it's sort of sad in today's culture that we demonize, the media and popular culture demonizes Sir John A. Macdonald, and they call him an architect of genocide and that he was responsible for all of these horrible things. Obviously people had different views back then and different norms and different ways of thinking about different people from different backgrounds and people from different cultures, particularly the First Nations, and some of the treatment towards First Nations people in our country by today's standard is absolutely appalling. But the idea that we sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater, that we cancel Sir John A. Macdonald, I think a lot of those initiatives are pretty partisan, because obviously there were other, the opposition Liberals at the time wanted to go even further with regards to policies to sort of completely diminish or make the First Nations populations disappear. And so we sort of look at Sir John A. in a vacuum, whereas what we should look at him for, is what it was like at the time. And obviously, we don't celebrate him for his flaws. We celebrate him for the remarkable accomplishment of building a country and having that vision and enacting it. So I think that there is a connection that you can make there between conservatives today and those who feel patriotic towards Canada, towards our traditions, towards the sort of early acts of developing this country, big national sort of plans to build a country. It's funny because today the sort of liberals, the modern symbols of Canada are very liberal, right? Like the flag, that was devised by the Liberals, and it was a bitter battle because John Diefenbaker didn't want the new flag and he wanted the old flag. And when it comes to Canada Day, it used to be called Dominion Day, and that was a symbol of our connection to the British Empire. They called it the Dominion of Canada. It's biblical, right? It's like, this is a majestic place, and they got rid of that. They didn't want anything. The Liberals didn't want the old British symbols. The Conservatives did, and so modern Canada, all these symbols are very much tied to the Liberal Party. The Canadian flag looks like the Liberal Party logo, right? It's like the same colors and everything. And so it's hard for conservatives to try to be patriotic about a country that's been very branded as sort of big L liberal in the Justin Trudeau sense of liberal, not in the sort of classical liberal sense. And so there is some sort of soul searching that happens. But I think, especially in today's era where the left and even big L liberals are so happy to dismiss Canada as this horrible colonialist settler society that was built on racism and genocide and slavery, you see more of a conservatives as being the ones that defend Canada and say, no, wait, Canada's a great country, and sort of defending the things that Liberals used to defend like 10 years ago about Canada. So there's some interesting dynamics at play there.
Yeah, no, it's that is a weird twist. There's an irony even built in that from the from the charter, even the fact that it's often the case in Parliament, it's Conservative MPs who are the ones standing up for charter rights more often and more pervasively often than Liberal counterparts are. I find that ironic, considering how the origins of the formation of it. There's a real irony to that. I consider the point we are now. That's a really good point too, Candice. And I like to expand what you're saying. That I think you answered a question I was going to have on like the past and the future. Well, maybe not the future, at least the present though. But what do you think of the future of Canadian conservatism at this interval we're at right now? Because it is, and this is kind of another question built into this. Federally, we're kind of a mess. We're kind of a mess right now. I think it would be a fair statement in Canada. I look at it as a Canadian to a Canadian. We're in a kind of a messy point right now. But do you think there's more hope and more unanimity on the regional and provincial levels?
Well, I just want to ask you a question. I mean, I think Canada's a mess. I think COVID has created a huge mess with regards to civil liberties and the sort of failure of many of our institutions and the overarching power of the health bureaucrats and defer to the experts sort of mentality. But I'm curious, Matthew, why do you think Canada's a mess right now?
Oh, I think it's a mess. I think it's a mess on a federal level right now. I think there's overarching powers from both. I think there's not enough pushback from the opposition, and I think that is detrimental. We're built up in such a way, a parliamentary system is built up in such a way to have an official opposition for a reason. We're built on a binary system. We are a two-party system. I think there's too much misnomers that America's a two-party system. I would refute that neither Republican nor Democratic parties are actually parties. They're large factions where we are parties. We are parties, and you have to have a little infighting, but you also have to have people who are going to disagree. That's democracy, even within a party. But at the same time, there's been not enough pushback about really pervasive policies that benefit no one, short term or long, by an official opposition in Canada. And subsequently, the party in power, Liberal Party, minority party at present, has been just too pervasive with what they've done. Very flip-floppy in turn, and also just very overarching policies that have just been and will be progressively detrimental.
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. It's just a very weak. I mean, I think that there was a strategy on behalf of the Federal Conservative Party in the last election that they were basically going to try to correct basically every criticism from the legacy media over the last 5 years. Like the legacy media were very critical of Andrew Scheer as leader because he was Catholic and because he was socially conservative, and they didn't really let him focus on what he wanted to talk about. They wanted to focus the entire election on picking apart his social conservative values. And so the idea was, okay, let's find a candidate that isn't socially conservative. And they found Erin O'Toole, who very proudly socially left-wing or socially progressive when it comes to all of the sort of hot button issues of the day. And so the idea was like, okay, let's find this guy that sort of mirrors the Liberals in terms of values, so that won't be a distraction, and then he can focus on the conservative bread and butter stuff like economics and finances and stuff. But then when it came to their fiscal policy, it was like more spending, more government. It wasn't really clear what they were going to do differently. Yeah. So I agree. And then you also have a leader that sort of has a weak character and changes his mind and won't stand his ground and sort of tries to make up by that by expelling people who have marginally critical ideas out of the party. So
and especially someone who was I guess you might say current or former member of the or former in the sense that it's no longer, but of the progressive conservative branch of the party. So that's funny too, where it's not like it's some sort of it's funny to me. That whole incident was funny to me when the senator.
Well, there's a lot of it going on, right? Like he kicked out the sort of problematic right-wing elements with regards to Derek Sloan. He got kicked out, and then there was another popular socially conservative MP, Pierre Lemieux, who wasn't allowed to run. Jonas Smith, who was a popular social conservative up in the Yukon, wasn't able to run. So he purged a lot of SOCONs as well. But then after the election, I mean, he pushed Peter MacKay out of the party, and then Denise Batters, who was she was a progressive conservative.
That one was that one was a personal blow to me. I mean, I happily say Peter MacKay was somebody I would have happily voted for. I would have happily voted for. I thought he had leadership abilities. He had not only he had foresight, and I think Peter has the qualities you want for a leader at present, but also into the future.
Yeah, well, I like his wife quite a bit. I think she's wonderful. She's Persian,
she is.
and my husband's also Persian, and so that we had that in common. But yeah, it's a beautiful family, and I think they have, again, it's unfortunate that they weren't removed from the party, but then we're still seeing it. There was a civil liberties caucus that was formed around a member of parliament named Marilyn Gladue, and they O'Toole shut that down. You kind of want the Conservatives to have a civil liberties caucus. You want them to be focused on encroachment and overreach of government powers. And, that's sort of one of the things that brought me to the political right and the Conservatives. So, okay, I completely agree that the federal Conservative Party is a bit of a mess, and need to get themselves sorted out if they have any chance of taking on and beating Justin Trudeau in an election. As far as sort of regional and provincial Conservatives, it's sort of interesting because, like I think you mentioned this, that each region of the country has its own sort of flavor, and that's one of the successes of Canada as well. Is that unlike the U.S. is also a very diverse regional place, but they have a very strong, heavy-handed federal government, and the states have lesser powers, and I think that's a detriment and something that Conservatives in the U.S. fight for. In Canada, we have a pretty good separation of powers. We have a pretty strong system of federalism where, for instance, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to education, those are all run by provincial governments, and so because of that, you can kind of experiment and try different things in different parts of the country, where you can have a new good curriculum introduced in Alberta, and then if it's successful, it can get implemented in other places. You can experiment with a carbon tax out in British Columbia and see how that works in terms of, does it actually reduce emissions? Does it raise revenues? What does it do? Before you go and try to implement it into a big country. So I think regionalism and federalism is a strength in Canada, in large part because Quebec has demanded to have its own authority and jurisdiction, and because of that, we see that across the provinces, which again, it's a great structure. And the last thing that you really want is to be sitting. I grew up in Vancouver, and I went to high school out on Vancouver Island, and I remember how absurd I thought it was that people in Ottawa were making decisions that impacted my day-to-day life. The people over there, it's just so far away. It feels like another country, another world. And why would they? How would they have any idea what's best for someone, a family living out on Vancouver Island? And the idea of sort of separation and the lowest level of government having more responsibility. I think that's exactly what you want, and Canada is a pretty good model of that as well.
I concur with that, and well said, Candice. I concur. I think there is this, from a federal level, there is this complete, and I think it's always there, but it's always there in varying degrees. I think that's the right way to put it, is this distance from the provinces, this, especially from the West and from the East, unless it's something to do with Central, there seems this vast distance, and this I'm not there, but I'm making policy that's impacting based on either very rigid, very narrow, rather, data, or just because it seems right. And I think that's a very, very, it's one of the odd cruxes, of the way we have our federalism set up in Canada, because it is built up in such a way where, in one sense, the provinces, I think you're always in conflict. You're always in conflict with trade, interprovincial trade, and so forth, and trade disputes. But at the same time, when it comes to a federal level, there is that complete distance from the average individual, the goings on in Vancouver, the goings on in Calgary, in PEI, the goings on in Nova Scotia, for that matter. There's a really distancing from what's going on there, and I don't think, I don't know. I don't know if it's really reconcilable. If it's really reconcilable to a better level, to where there is, a greater understanding from the federal government to the provincial governments and especially the people that reflect better with policy. I'd like to hope and like to think there is, but I don't see any potential at present.
I think you're right. I think that the best role for the federal government is to sort of mediate and facilitate interprovincial activities and more interprovincial understanding. Like some of the strangest things as a Canadian, in some ways, it's easier to move from the Canada to the U.S. in terms of getting set up than it is. Like I remember when I first moved from Western Canada to Ontario, just trying to figure out how to get a health card and how to, I went to the doctor and I realized that I wasn't actually set up and enrolled, so I had to pay out of pocket, even though I'm Canadian. I'm like, wait a minute, I'm Canadian. How come I have to pay for healthcare? And it's like, oh, well, you have to enroll with the Ontario service and you have to do all this stuff. And I just didn't know I had to do that. So I did that and whatever, but it's like, yeah, like if you're trained as a nurse in one province and you try to work in another, forget about it, right? Or some of these court cases, like I guess it's technically illegal to bring alcohol across the border. I didn't know that either. I remember I went to school in Alberta, and you might have a bottle of wine in the trunk or something like that, and you don't realize it. There's really a lot of strange barriers when it comes to, part of the purpose of Canada initially, like we talked about, was creating an economic union, right?
Right.
And the fact that we have the federal government in many ways just acts as a large redistributor, right? They collect all the taxes, and so much of the spending. I used to work at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and looking at the actual line by line budget and how much of the federal government is simply just literally mailing checks to people, like the largest department in the federal government. It used to be called HRSUC. It's like Human Resources Skills Development. It's just the welfare state. It's like, mailing out social services checks, EI checks, mailing out, family child care benefits. The biggest line item in the entire federal government is health transfers, and also I don't know what it is now. It used to be 17% of all federal spending went to OAS, GIS. So just sending checks to retired Canadians, right? So the federal government doesn't really do all that much.
I think that's the
collect all this money and distribute it. Although I think Trudeau government is trying to change that by growing it, but still,
I think a lot of Canadians don't realize that that's the traditional function of the, whether it's boorish or not, it's the traditional function of our federal system, of our federal system in Canada. I think people have this more illuminated concept of it's grander than thou. And I say it's really not. It's just a moderator, a mediator between the provinces at best, and as you perfectly said, a redistributor.
Yeah, and that's why the entire sort of equalization, you hear a lot of grumbling from Alberta and Western Canadian provinces about equalization, but it's really just the idea that they collect a lot more taxes in Western Canada and spend a lot more money in Central Canada and Eastern Canada. And that's basically part of the fiscal federalism that we have, that so many Canadians feel is unfair and unjust, and they want sort of opening of the Constitution to have these discussions, but it's like, good luck with that. You have to have all the agreement of all the provinces, and so many provinces benefit from it. So why would they bother?
Absolutely. In keeping with that, why do you think? I have two questions. They're kind of opposite ends of the country, but they're on provincial level. Why do you think Alberta, and not just from the Trudeau government recently, why do you think Alberta gets a bad rap from everybody else who's not Albertans? Like, especially if you're not even a conservative, but there's a completely whole area of Canada so many people don't understand, and for that matter, I think they don't even give themselves a chance, an ability to understand. Not the everyday life of the everyday person there, the economy there, even the politics there. It is different. Mm-hmm. Politics is going to be different from Vancouver to Nunavut to Saskatchewan, and rightly so. But no one seems to give a chance to Alberta to understand why things are the way they are there, why it's manifested the way it has there, and why even why the economy, why the politics, and that particular field of conservatism, why it's manifested the way it has. They just usually point a finger and something, say, oh, that's, as I'm sure we've all heard so many times, that they're like more American over there. Like that's completely dribble to me. That makes no sense.
Yeah, it's like sort of intellectually lazy, right? It's
Yeah.
just like, oh, they're conservative, therefore they must be more like. But although there is something to the fact that immigration patterns historically have been quite different. So I pay attention to polling. I read a lot of polls, and I like to see the regional breakdowns. And I did find that this idea that Canada's split into sort of two, like French Canada and English Canada, it's not true. It's much more. There's much more regional nuance to that. And if anything, Alberta is just as distinct, or Alberta and Saskatchewan are just as
Yeah.
distinct in terms of the way of thinking. If you look at polling data, a lot of times British Columbia, Ontario, and the Maritime provinces and Manitoba more or less have similar numbers and trends. And then Alberta will be completely different, and Quebec will be different. I should say Alberta and Saskatchewan, because Alberta and Saskatchewan basically it's an artificially division. Did you know that when they were first looking to join Confederation in 1905, they wanted to come in as one province known as Buffalo, and the governing Liberals at the time said, no, we're going to split them up because we don't want them to ever rival the political power and the population of Ontario or Quebec. So they deliberately split it into two, which is why it's just a straight line down the middle. And so that was by design to lessen their influence and power, and it has worked, unfortunately, sadly. Yeah, there's a different history. There's different immigration patterns. When I went to school in Alberta. I went to the University of Alberta, and I was a little surprised when I moved from British Columbia to Alberta, because I found that the people were different, right? Like in British Columbia, where I'm from, most of my friends came from sort of, I would say, uh, very much, like, broadly speaking, the British Isles. Like that's where most of the Canadian people were from. And then we had a lot of new Canadians, a lot of people from Hong Kong, people from India. But for the most part, the Canadian people, the white Canadians, were mostly British. When I moved to Alberta, it wasn't like that at all. They were mostly Polish and Ukrainian, and there were all kinds of really rich, different types of Eastern European cultures and foods and cuisines. And it was just okay. It's a little bit different in that regard. And I guess people who would come and settle on the prairies might be different than people who go and move to the coast. So they're sort of a little bit nuanced differences in that regard. And then also, just with regards to the main industry being oil and gas, people are typically more pro oil and gas, and that's sort of, as we've seen the growth of the environmental movement in the last 15, 20 years, demonizing this industry and trying to, it's almost by impulse that they're going to defend themselves. And anyone who knows people within the oil and gas industry know that it's sort of like the leading environmentalists, the people who care the most about geology, and the leading geologists and scientists and engineers go into these oil and gas companies, and they think they're doing a pretty good job in terms of their environmental stewardship, and yet they're getting demonized as if they were polluting like the Saudis do or something like that. And it's like such a disconnect between living there and seeing the people who work in this industry versus the way that it's sort of dismissed and discussed if you're watching on the CBC. And so I think it's certainly there's economic issues, there's cultural issues, there's historic issues, but it is a distinct region of the country that I think deserves its own sort of voice and representation that is separate from the rest of English Canada, because they do have separate, like I said, separate culture, separate economic issues, separate focus. And I think that as a country, all Canadians should want each Canadian to have a fair shake. Like I don't have qualms against Quebec, people in Quebec having their own representation. They clearly have their own language that they want to uphold. They have their own values. They have their own history. They have their own priorities, and I respect that. I don't understand why there isn't the same reciprocity and respect extended to people in the prairies that I think deserve just as much respect and
I think that's
authority.
Beautifully said, Candice. Beautifully said. I concur. It's not the fact that we always say about Quebec that it's distinct. Well, every province by definition is distinct. They have a different feel, different history, different cultural history, different social history for that matter, and certainly different immigration patterns too. Engross that, even feel that feeling more with the politics too, and the social and the diversion of people and so forth. So yeah, I think that's exactly, that kind of brings me to a thought. What then would you think? What technique, what method, what approach do you think more Canadians or should be taught, or should be just endeavor to pursue more in some particular way? What do you think should be said or done to have more Canadians realize that they're all distinct, each province, each territory, but also to endeavor to understand more outside of their region, outside of their territory, outside of their province more. I mean, I think we do have
Yeah.
that in general. I think we have that. I think that is one of the at issues in Canada is our how would I phrase this? Maybe our regional or maybe more provincial ignorance. We only often know, if you were to ask the average person, they might not know the current premier of Nova Scotia. They might not know the current premier of PEI, but they certainly will know their own premier, and they certainly will know their own politics in their region and province, certainly.
Yeah, no, it's a really difficult question, right? Because it's like, how can you make people feel more empathy towards their fellow Canadians? How can you
Yeah.
make people want to uphold that principle of reciprocity that should be, or even just treating all Canadians equally? I'm going to pitch an idea that's sort of outside the box here, but I think that one of the things that I've been thinking about this a lot, because I think that Canada suffers from a lack of community, a lack of understanding. Really, we're retreating into individual silos, and whether it be sort of new Canadians not really branching out and meeting other Canadians, or Canadians not really branching out and meeting. If you live in a rural part of the country, you don't really have a lot in common with someone else. A lot of people. I grew up again in BC. I had a lot of First Nations friends, but I know a lot of people in Ontario have never really even interacted or met with First Nations people. So
Right.
my idea, and I haven't fully fleshed it out, but what I think that something that could greatly benefit Canada would be to introduce some kind of a national service, have all young people sign up, and maybe it's compulsory or maybe not, but have them serve the country together for a year or two, and the same way that Israel does. So before, after high school, before they go away to university, Canadians go from all walks of life, go together, go somewhere, in the country, and take part in some kind of a nation building project, whether it be, helping to create more infrastructure in the north, or building better drinking water capacity, or planting trees for the environment, whatever it is, but have some kind of a nation building project where people from all over Canada, go together, they get bunked together, they meet each other, they spend 6 weeks in basic training where they learn about health and fitness, and they get bunked with people from all different walks, First Nations, new Canadians, urban, rural, everybody, actually meeting people and developing friendships, developing a sense of understanding. Like when I was 18, I went to the University of Alberta, so I did meet some people from some other parts of the country, but I still didn't really meet anybody from, other socioeconomic backgrounds, right? You kind of meet people that come from a similar
Right.
socioeconomic background. You don't really meet people that come from the total opposite side of the country, because people tend to go to school in a general area around where they grew up and where they're close to their families, right? You don't really meet people who are necessarily First Nations, because there aren't really a lot of First Nations people, or you don't necessarily meet people from different ethnic groups, new Canadians, because they might keep to their own, or they might feel intimidated to go and sign up for student council, a place where you can meet other people. So I think some kind of a program where Canadians come together, spend a couple weeks, a couple months, maybe a year, doing something, gaining that purpose, gaining that sense of community, that sense of responsibility and duty to your country, learning about other people. I think that there's something to the idea. I think someone much smarter than me can hash it out and try to understand what it might look like in Canada. But I think going forward, I think something like that would help solve some of our problems in terms of not really understanding each other, not really feeling connected. It might give a renewed sense of citizenship and community, that I think is really greatly needed in Canada.
Certainly, in a roundabout kind of way, and in kind of a historically funny way, it would, I think, that a project of that nature would achieve what, as I'm infamous for saying, not on this podcast, but friends of mine know me for saying this, the real Trudeau, Pierre, the concept he had, which kind of died out very quickly, I think after the mid 80s, if even that, was the Pan Canada approach, the idea of we're Canadian. It's not just a regional thing, but there's also a national identity. There's a national idea, and I think that the nature of that project of that sort, I think, would really bring that home to a lot of individuals. It's like, yeah, I'm seeing a fellow Canadian from a different walk of life, from a different part of the country, and I'm not just knowing them, but I'm getting a chance to understand them. I'm getting to understand why they do things differently and why they live their life differently, and why, and the similarities too, the contrasts and comparisons between us. And you realize at the end of the day, we're both Canadians.
Right, we're all Canadians. We have the same core set of values. We just maybe have different ways of looking at the world. And I think it would go a long way for empathy as well, to understand. I mean, if you think about someone who's 18, 19, they're so open, right? They haven't been sort of set in their ways yet. They want to learn. And friendship is such an important sort of understated way of learning about the world and learning about other people. And I think that, especially today's day and age, you're so connected to people. Like if you could develop a group of friends when you're 18, 19, that come from all these different backgrounds, you'll have those friends forever, and or for a long time. And I think, again, it would go, it would manifest and grow in so many ways. It's hard to even foresee, but it would actually even be potentially a good way at grooming a better generation of political leaders, because a lot of times you sort of look around at the current crop of politicians and you're like, really, is this the best we can come up with in our country? Whereas if you had these young civil leaders that were out there learning about their country, learning about the different issues that someone in PEI might have versus someone in Northern Ontario versus someone in downtown Toronto, get them thinking about the country and how we can make it even better. I think it could have tremendous results, although I can't really imagine any political party picking up this idea and implementing it, although who knows?
It could be bipartisanship, perhaps.
Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't that be an ideal world?
That would be interesting, though. I mean, that would be that is something to toil about in one's thought, because that would, a project of that nature, again, as I said, that would, I could see that. I can see that in my mind right now. Having, as I said, an 18-year-old from one part of the country come together at some project, whether we're planting trees or something to do on a national level, before going off to college, and really getting to know other individuals, other men and women across the country from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different cultures, different provinces, different regions, and the different fields that come from there. And the richness of a friendship from that nature. And as you said, if you're able to really diversify your friendships and have these friendships in different walks of life, you're living a golden lifestyle. You're living gold, because I know that from experience. My friends come from every bit walk of life, background, and it's rich. In our friendship, we view things differently in many ways, some politically, some socially, but at the end of the day, we live up to something I think is so rare. All of us, all our friendships, is love is the only subject. We don't really care. And I wear on my hand, actually, it's funny you mentioned your well, not funny, it's ironic, you mentioned your husband being Persian, and about Peter McKay's wife, is I wear the Persian stone, the lapis, the Greek and Persian stone lapis on my finger, as a point to always remember that. I always want to be totally aware of what's going on, and just step back from things and realize there's more important things than this little timbit of a moment where we might have a little spat. That spat, if anything, should enrich in our friendship, and should enrich in the fact that we care more about each other, and more about the fact that this difference should not be in conflict with our friendship.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can all gain from knowing other perspectives. And just to swing back to what I mentioned earlier about when my husband and I lived in California for a few years, it was right during the 2016 presidential election. And I think at that point it became most evident that there were sort of two Americas here. There are two silos. And if you watch legacy media, if you watch CNN and you read the New York Times, and even if you read, the sort of fancy conservative outlets, like I'm a big fan of the National Review, and I remember National Review put out it's a conservative journal, started by Bill Buckley in the 70s, and it's still very much sort of the home of intellectual conservatives in the US. And they put out a full magazine, essay after essay after essay after essay by leading conservatives saying, do not elect Donald Trump. Donald Trump is dangerous for our republic. He will take us down an irreversibly dangerous path. And that was so fully rejected by Republican, this is during a primary, so fully rejected by Republican, base and the conservative base. And the way that the media reported the 2016 election, they didn't even give a shake to Donald Trump, right? And then when Donald Trump won, it became so evident that they were so out of touch. And most people didn't know any Trump supporters, right? Like I lived in the Bay Area, I didn't know any Trump supporters. Most of my Canadian conservative friends didn't want to go anywhere near Trump, right? They were very opposed to Trump, but I realized, like, we live in these silos where it would be nice to get to know people and try to understand them, not in a way to try to demonize them and say, look at these horrible Trump supporters, but understand what motivated them and why they voted for this candidate. And I think that was a big it should have been a big wake up call to all of us, that we need to try to understand each other, try to instead of just diminish one another or use strawman arguments against the other side, like actually take the best intention of the other side and be united by your humanity and have respect and dignity for people that you disagree with. And I think that that's something that, again, friendships, I think having friendships with people from different walks of life and different backgrounds can really help you understand what motivates them and what's important to them and what their values are. And I think that we would all benefit, again, from just getting to know each other a little better.
Yeah, I completely agree with that too. And I think that's one thing, at least, again, from my perspective, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this from my perspective. I think, especially with respect to the 2016 election, I think you're right on that. They didn't give him a fair shake right from the standpoint. And I think that has, the evident, I would say more of a media polarization via the media is so evident, where it's not like that here, but there's a different feel to it here. It's kind of a different manifestation, where it's so obvious. You literally have one media which is so evidently conservative and varying degrees of conservatism, and you have one segue and another segue of the American media that's so evidently on the left or so evidently liberal that there's no in between. I mean, you could easily say that CNN kind of lost their whole mindset in 2016. They went crazy, and now it's just he's clickbait for them.
It's not journalism, right? It's advocacy, and it's cheerleading, and they vary. I mean, and there's bigger, more concerning factors like how the social media giants play in censoring legitimate news stories. If they're bad for Democrats, and it's overtly partisan, and I think that's very troubling. I think it does exist in Canada as well. Part of the reason my organization True North has been successful is because we're sort of open. Like, look, we believe in fact-based reporting. We're always going to, have properly vetted stories. We're always going to make sure that our sources are sound. And when you go to get your news from True North, you can trust that it's fact-based. If we ever make a mistake, we're super quick to retract it and apologize and say that the story, we got it wrong. And when it comes to our editorial position, we're conservative. We believe in limited government and individual liberty and human dignity and all these things. So that if you're getting your news from True North, you're getting a fact-based conservative worldview or perspective.
Right.
Whereas when you turn on the CBC, you're told you're just getting neutral news, but you're not. You're not. The CBC is not neutral. The CBC is very biased. They're very beholden to the Liberal government. Trudeau has nearly doubled their budget since coming into office. Every time there's an election, he pledges more annual funding to the CBC, and in return, he gets really good glowing coverage. The basis of every line of questioning to Conservatives during a federal election from the media is based on the Liberal talking points of the day and Liberal wedge issues and Liberal spin. So you're not getting straight news. You're getting left-wing news. And it's funny because there's a new app, it's called Groundswell, and it analyzes the bias of major news outlets. And
Ground News, I think.
Ground News, Ground News, yeah.
From Kitchener.
I'm not sure where it's based. I just know that it also tells you how your media is funded. Is it independent? Is it corporate? Is it funded by a wealthy benefactor? And the CBC is left. It's 100% left. That's their bias. So you should know that when you're reading it, when you're engaging it, that this perspective, even though they pretend to be neutral, how do they frame the story? Who are their sources? Who do they interview? Who do they get quotes from? Right? Like, if you just take a step back and look at it through sort of a critical lens, it's like, okay, they're interviewing left-wing activists. The perspective of the piece is, for instance, like very anti-industry, very pro sort of protesters or whatever the issue is. It's pretty easy to take a step back and dissect it.
Right.
Unfortunately, most Canadians don't have time for that. They don't sit and read the news from a critical perspective.
No.
They just read the news to get the information, and they might not even realize that the information that they're getting is being delivered in a very deliberate ideological way.
Yes, no, I concur with that. True, and that I think the age we're in with online media sources such as yourself and the one you've created at True North is the prime time for diversifying your news media intake. If we want to diversify our nutrition, we should also diversify our news intake as well. And I think knowing that what you're watching is coming from a particular perspective and a particular ideology, and subsequently a particular intent as to what is wanting you to take away from that story or focus on in that story, should be known to the reader and to the watcher. I used to be an avid watcher of CBC, and I slowly became like, I just drifted away from it. I was like, no, I just can't. It's not even, I don't know what's being reported anymore. It's not even reporting it on anything. So
yeah, they don't even focus on Canada. Like I remember oftentimes it'd be like a big political story, like the WE scandals breaking in Ottawa, and they're in committee and they're getting somewhere. And the top three stories on CBC National are all international. It's like, this is what Trump is doing, and this is what's happening in Brexit, and then back to Trump, and then like the Canadian stuff is like buried at the back. It's like,
right.
What's the point of having a Canadian broadcaster? Like if I wanted to get the U.S. news, I'll just flip to CNN or Fox or MSNBC or 1,000 other U.S. channels. But the purpose of the CBC is to report on stuff that's going on in Canada. There's lots of stuff going on in Canada, but for some reason they think that the biggest story is, their very distorted, manipulative take on a U.S. issue that's not relevant at all to Canadians.
Right. And do you think that too, Candice? I wonder, do you think that fact that there are, I don't know the percentages, but I would think it's a large number of Canadians who don't realize that when they're watching the CNN, it's not neutral, and they are getting a particular perspective on events, on occurrences within Canada and abroad, that indirectly factors into a perceived, say, for yourself, as I know the barrage I've heard from people. I shake my head at saying, oh, they're the far right, and this misunderstanding of this conflating of conservatism with far right within Canada especially, and this misunderstanding of these two things altogether when it comes to news reporting and all that goes along with it. Do you think there's that factors into it in some way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's sort of a whole media collusion with the Trudeau government, with the Liberals. They're pushing this idea that there's an extreme far-right element that's somehow a threat to our country, and they're using that as a basis for regulating the internet and introducing all kinds of heavy-handed hate speech legislations. And you see, the CBC and the Toronto Star and Postmedia even drumming up fear about these so-called threat. And they don't bother to make the distinction between what it means to be far right versus conservative. They'll happily conflate the two. They'll even accuse someone like Erin O'Toole, who's basically a capital L liberal, with the far right, and they basically said he was Trumpy because he wanted Canadian flags to be raised back to full staff. It's like, where are we in Canada where you can't even say let's raise the flags up after an indefinite amount of time for an indefinite reason, and just saying, hey, it's almost Canada Day, let's raise the flags up. It's like, you're far right. The far right doesn't have a meaning then, if that's far right. And when people call True North alt-right or far right, it's like people don't understand what these terms mean. Obviously, True North is, we find the alt-right, the actual alt-right, the people who want a white ethno state, to be completely racist, despicable, and delusional, and we don't want anything to do with that movement. In fact, the alt-right hates me. They troll me on social media all the time, and I hate them too. So to conflate me with them is absurd, right? It's like, absolutely. But it's a tactic. They try to discredit people. They try to smear you so that so that people who aren't aware, they might say, oh, I don't want anything to do with conservatives because they're far right, and I hate the far right. I hate Nazis. It's like, yeah, we all hate Nazis. Like
Yeah.
we fought a
Yeah.
war against them. My ancestors fought a war against them, and it's sort of a sad state of political discourse when, rather than actually having honest discussions about our country and what we want and what we believe in, you have people on the left and the liberals just smearing the other side, so they don't even have to have a debate. It's like,
Right.
why debate ideas when you can just smear the other side? And the fact that the media sort of goes along with it, obviously it's because of the conflict of interest happening there with funding, but it's like it's sort of a sad state of affairs
I
in that
certainly
regard.
concur with that. Unfortunately, I concur with that, but yes. In keeping with that, then, do you think, Candice, that, or rather, how would you say, in keeping with that, what is the misunderstanding? And I think there's a couple of ways I interpret this question when I phrase it, but there's a way, say, on campaigns within Canada currently, the previous one with Trudeau and the former one with Scheer with Trudeau, is how they portray conservatives, not just conservatism, but conservatives in a very narrow, very limited, very archaic kind of framework, even within the Canadian sphere. I mean, I step back and laugh and, like, I don't know who these people are they're describing. What misunderstanding do you think of who are not conservative, who are liberal, or who are maybe moderate, centrist in some sense? What do you think is a misunderstanding that has just been so popularized, whether it's topical or perception about conservatives, individuals, politically or non-politically? What do you think is a misconception within the Canadian framework that should be debunked?
Well, people think that conservatives are small-minded and backwards looking, and that they are inherently racist, homophobic, bigoted people. And I mean, that's just like a stupid argument. I mean, conservatives obviously have to work to counter that, but it's like the political left and they've taken a caricature of the right. It came largely from like the Christian right in the US and kind of grew out of the whole Bush era, and a whole new era of late night talk show television. Jon Stewart and all these other followers that have come in his place. It's like the punchline is always the same. It's always like, look at how stupid these guys are. Look at these crazy Republicans. Look at these crazy conservatives. And as far as what that perception is, from my understanding, my experience of being in the conservative movement, going to conservative conventions, working with conservative think tanks and free market think tanks, and working with conservative academics, and being part of a conservative media company, that's not it's not a real reflection of conservatives in this country. It's not a reflection of the values, the beliefs, the people. It's just false. But it's so easy for the left to create this caricature and kind of run with it, without giving the other side a fair shake, without trying to combat their ideas, with just trying to combat them with these sort of awful ad hominems. The media goes along with it, and many Canadians who perhaps don't know conservatives, or who maybe they came from conservative families and then they moved away, and get along with those family members or something like that. They might buy into it, but it's like, the modern conservative movement in Canada is very cosmopolitan and diverse, and true diversity, right? You have people from the rural parts of the country, you have people from the cities, people from Quebec, you have new Canadians who might have very strongly held religious beliefs, versus this sort of what got Stephen Harper in trouble once for saying the old stock Canadians, who, if they are religious, very, very private about it, and they're not openly evangelical in the way that people have this perception of the Christian right in Canada being. It's not really accurate. So I think probably it's on conservatives to go out there and prove that they don't, they're not the monsters that the left has created of them. It's also on, a level of political discourse in our country where people would rather create these sort of straw man ad hominem caricatures, as opposed to just actually debating ideas and trying to see what conservatives can offer by opposing. And I think they've scared conservatives into just being shadows of their former selves. We have someone like Erin O'Toole is afraid to take a conservative position on any issue.
Precisely.
Anytime he he came moderately close to a conservative issue on the campaign trail. He just walked away from it and flip-flopped because he didn't want to go, he didn't want to have one bad day of publicity in the press. So he just abandoned it all. And I think we've got our work cut out for us, but
Precisely.
it's a challenge for sure. But
and I think you narrowed it down to me exactly. And it is a very lackadaisical, narrow-minded to present a limited framework. And I think, as as you alluded to really well, Candice, this kind of Bush era Christian conservative American version, which the template doesn't fit on us. We don't have it. We are, within the conservative movement in Canada, it's very diverse. Little C, big C, social conservatives. There's a bunch in that, and even I would say, even in how that manifests per the individual is going to be different. Get to know somebody.
I guess it goes back to the idea of friendship.
Yeah, it goes back to the idea of friendship. I mean, I don't know. It's the way my mind processes. I don't know. I would not want to label somebody. I'm always fond of that book, beautifully written book by a fellow Canadian. She lives in the U.S. now. Is Ishrid Manji. Her most recent book is "Don't Label Me," and I think it's such a beautiful book. It was for several years ago she wrote it, and it's all about that. Don't put these titles on me of different things. Get to know me. Get to know me, and once you know me, you realize the continuity, the commonality of all of us. We're walking ambiguities.
Right, exactly.
We're all these things, and I think that's a beautiful thing to realize.
Well, I was going to say that people. The reason I myself didn't like being labeled a conservative is because I had negative perception of conservatives based on the media and based on that era as well, and it's like. Yeah, I mean, I finally embrace it because there's no point in denying it. It's like, this is what I believe in and this is what I think is right. But again, like, what I say is conservatism for me might not be the same as what any other conservative says is conservatism. They may have a totally different way of using that word and that framework. And I remember when I was younger and first writing books, I was really adamant that conservatives try to take back the word liberal because the idea that today's modern liberal party is liberal is sort of laughable. They're the party of restrictions, big government, heavy-handedness, top down. When it comes, and even just this idea that they want to regulate the internet. I mean, that's not liberal, right? There's something liberal about these guys, and it's like we believe in liberalism. We believe in true individual liberty, economic freedom, all of these values. We should take this word back and not let them have it. But then it's like, if you walk around calling yourself a liberal, 99% of people are just going to say, okay, then you're a just and true liberal. And it's like, and then you have to have a 5-minute conversation with them about how you're not. And, you might not be able to talk about other things. So it's like, you kind of just have to be resigned to accept the labels right. Change, and the meaning of words change.
You stumble on a conversation I'm fond of having often, is that very notion of the idea of, and I say, don't equate the liberal party with liberalism. And I think that's a good equation. I think there is a sense with, I think the idea and the concept of liberalism is not a party. It's not a party. It's everything. It's a constitution. It's a Bill of Rights, individual freedom, it's civil liberties. It's the freedom of expression. It's the freedom to exist in the world and do as you conduct yourself in a particular way in the world. It's all these things that we so cherish, that we've come. The forebears have thought, contrived, manifested, argued over, and thought about. And we are the preservers of these things. We are the preservers of these things at present. They don't just come magically and stay forever. But I think that's how I've always looked at it, as in the Canadian framework. It's the fact that the current Liberal Party, under Justin Trudeau, is more on the left than it is in the center historically. For the last previous 80, 90 years, it was always a centrist party. It's certainly not that, evidently not that now. But liberalism is something that I think transcends party politics. It transcends left and right. It's what the ideally, it's what both maneuvers. It's what any Western democratic country functions in, is the idea of liberalism.
Oh, I completely agree, and I think that it's our birthright to preserve our liberties, and that's not what this liberal government is doing. So conservatives have to oppose, and they have to fight against it, and they have to stand up and do exactly what you just said.
Absolutely, Candice. Well, I think this has been an illuminating conversation, Candice, and what you're doing, you and your colleagues at True North, I wish you all the best, and continue on doing this. And we need more voices, more. We talk of diversity in very ironically very narrow framework often, and just bog it down to the empirical standpoint. But we need more diversity of thought and outlets to news outlets such as yourself. We need that diversity of thought and the presentation of that thought. So I thank you for what you're doing.
I couldn't agree more, and I really appreciate your kind words. And it's been a great pleasure to join you, Matthew. Thank you so much for reaching out and having me on the show today.
Thank you very much, Candice.